I grew up in a place where the mountains swallowed secrets the way the creeks took fallen leaves, quietly, without fuss, carrying them somewhere dark where nobody bothered to look. Folks in my hometown didn't talk much about strange things, not because they didn't happen, but because acknowledging them felt like giving them permission to grow. So when Pastor Harlan stopped by my house one cold November morning and asked for my help, I already knew it wasn't a simple favor. People didn't go to him unless something had gone wrong, and pastors didn't seek help from 20-year-olds unless the wrong ran deep. He didn't explain much at first, just said a family from the ridge had brought their daughter to him. 17, troubled, refusing to eat, refusing to sleep, saying strange things. She frightens her mother, he told me on the walk to the church, and her father refuses to look at her. That's how bad it's gotten. He said it was spiritual confusion, the kind that needed prayer and steady presence. But as he talked, he kept rubbing the back of his hand like something underneath the skin hurt. I should have said no. I wasn't trained for any of this. My only experience with helping came from fixing the church steps or mowing the small cemetery behind the choir room. But he insisted he needed someone the girl didn't know. A calm witness is what he called it. Just sit with her. Keep the peace while I guide her. When we opened the basement door, the air hit me first. It was warm, far too warm for a stone-walled room in late autumn, and it smelled faintly like wet timber. The basement had always felt too tight, too low, like it was meant for storing winter coats rather than people. But that day, a strange weight hung in the air, like the room itself was holding its breath. Lila sat on a wooden chair in the middle of the floor. Her wrists weren't tied tightly, just enough to keep her from scratching herself, the pastor explained. Her eyes didn't blink when she looked up at me. She stared straight past my shoulder, her pupils wide, almost glassy, as though she was focusing on someone behind me. The hairs on my neck rose, even though I knew logically no one stood there. I told myself it was just the atmosphere of the room, or maybe the basement light making shadows in strange shapes. She sees things that aren't there, the pastor said quietly. Don't react to it. Just sit near her, talk to her if she talks first, and write down anything she says that seems unusual. Unusual. That was the word he used, but the way he paced the room and kept wiping his palms against his shirt told me he expected far more than unusual. The first night felt long. Lila barely spoke, just stared past me with the kind of stillness that made the room feel colder than it was. Pastor Harlan prayed the entire time, pacing in circles, whispering under his breath. I sat on an old folding chair, holding a notebook, unsure whether to write down her silence. Twice, she muttered something so soft I couldn't catch it, and each time the pastor stiffened like the air had gotten thin. When we left, he thanked me but didn't look me in the eye. Tomorrow might be easier, he said. These things usually get lighter with prayer. He was wrong. The second night, Lila's voice changed. Not dramatically or theatrically. Nothing like the movies. Just older. That was the only way I could describe it. Like someone who'd been tired for decades was speaking through her throat. When I asked if she wanted water, she said my full name. Not the name folks called me, but the name on my birth certificate. The one only my mother used when she was angry. I know what happened on the ridge, she whispered. I felt everything inside me go still. My family had once lived farther up the mountain, near a place locals avoided because of an old mining accident. Something awful happened to me there when I was a child, something I didn't talk about, not to family, not to friends. It wasn't anything supernatural. Just the kind of trauma that sticks to your bones when you're young. There was no way she should have known about it. Nobody but me carried that memory. Lila, I said carefully. Who told you that? She stared past me again, the same angle, the same unblinking focus. He's standing right behind you. It felt ridiculous to look over my shoulder. Childish. So I didn't. But my stomach tightened in a way I couldn't hide, and she saw it. She smiled, not a creepy smile, not malicious, just tired. Like she felt sorry for me. Pastor Harlan stepped between us and raised his voice in prayer. The louder he prayed, the softer she spoke, until eventually she fell silent and closed her eyes. I told myself she must have overheard something. Maybe two adults talking years ago, Or maybe someone in her family had known mine before I was born. There were 100 ways she could have stumbled upon a detail I thought was buried. That's what I repeated to myself the entire walk home. But that night, I locked my bedroom door for the first time in years. On the third night, the pastor looked frayed, like he hadn't slept. His hands shook as he tried unlocking the basement door. When we walked in, Lila didn't even glance at us. She was humming, softly, off-key, the kind of tune a grandmother might sing while peeling apples. It felt wrong coming from a 17-year-old's throat. "She hasn't eaten since yesterday," he whispered. "Won't take water. Won't answer her mother." As he prepared his prayer book, he asked me to sit closer to her than usual. "Just talk to her," he said. "Tell her about your day. Ground her in something normal." So I did. I told her about fixing the fence behind my house and about the neighbor's dog that kept stealing laundry from porches. I told her how cold it had gotten outside, that winter would come early this year. She stopped humming once. Looked at me. Really looked, not over my shoulder. "I was at your window last night." I swallowed. "You were home," I said gently. "You were here. With your parents." "That's not what I meant." Before I could ask what she did mean, the pastor interrupted again, his voice rising, his face blotchy with fear he didn't try to hide. He kept telling her she was confused, that she was projecting dreams onto waking moments. She laughed. Softly, almost kindly. It wasn't the laugh of someone possessed. It was the laugh of someone who knew a truth you didn't want to hear. On the fourth night, everything shifted. She wouldn't stop staring at the floor near my feet. Not my face, not the wall behind me. Just the floor, like something moved beneath the tile. For the first hour, she muttered to herself in that older voice, words I couldn't make out. The pastor tried ignoring it, but eventually he snapped and told her to stop. She didn't. He raised his voice. She whispered louder. Not screaming, not shaking, not any of the things you'd expect from someone out of control. Just two people talking over each other. One growing desperate, one growing calmer. I stepped back, unsure whether to intervene. That's when I saw it, a dark shape slide slowly across the floor near my shoe. Not a shadow cast from something above. There was nothing to cast it. The overhead light was steady. No movement in the room. And yet the shape glided from one tile to the next, deliberate, almost searching. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Basement moisture? A trick of light? A leak making the surface reflective? But the floor wasn't shiny, and the shape wasn't water. It had edges. Soft edges, but edges nonetheless. "Stop looking at him," Lila murmured. "He hates being noticed." Something cold ran down my spine. Not supernatural cold. Fear cold. The kind that comes from believing, even for a second, that you're losing your grip on what makes sense. I took a step back and the shadow, whatever it was, seemed to flatten itself, disappearing as though it had never been there. When I looked at the pastor, he wasn't watching the floor. His eyes were locked on the wall, unfocused, like he was trying to convince himself nothing had happened. He raised his voice again, praying so loudly the small basement echoed. By the end of the night, Lila had stopped speaking. She sat limp, her head tilted just enough that I could see she was awake but refusing to look at anyone. Her breathing was shallow, and for a moment I wondered whether we should take her to an actual doctor. But the pastor insisted that wasn't necessary. "She needs rest," he said. "Her family is taking her home tonight. They've decided this isn't the right path." I wanted to argue. Not because I thought something supernatural had happened, but because the girl needed real help. Medical help, psychological help, anything but an aging pastor reading prayers in a basement. But he avoided my eyes, grabbed his coat, and walked me to the door like a man eager to end a conversation before it began. The next day, when I asked about her, he said only that her family had moved. Left early this morning. They didn't want visitors. He didn't offer more, and I didn't know how to push him without sounding like I was accusing him of something. In a town this small, people don't move without someone noticing, yet nobody had seen a truck leave the ridge. Nobody saw any of Lila's family at the gas station, the market, or the church. They were simply gone. I told myself they must have left at dawn, taking the old road behind the ridge that bypassed most of town. I told myself that was the simplest explanation, but when I asked the pastor again a week later, he tensed like I'd touched a bruise. "Let it be," he said firmly. "They're safer where they are." Safer. That was the word he used. Life went back to what passed for normal, but something lingered in the quieter moments. When I lay in bed at night, I thought I heard someone whispering in that older voice, the one Lila had used. Not words, just the tone, the cadence, like someone thinking out loud. It always came from the corner of my room, near the closet I never bothered to shut. I told myself it was nothing more than stress. 4 nights in a church basement with a frightened girl would rattle anyone. The mind plays tricks. Memories warp. Sound carries strangely through old houses. I knew that. I clung to that. But one night, months later, I felt the distinct sense that someone stood behind me as I brushed my teeth. Not a presence, not a shadow. Just the instinct that if I turned around too quickly, I'd catch someone moving out of view. When I did turn, the doorway was empty. The hall was dark. The house was silent. I slept with the lamp on after that. Pastor Harlan never spoke of Lila again. Whenever I tried asking, he redirected the conversation, his voice tight, his face pale. Once he grabbed my arm and told me to stop digging, that whatever had happened wasn't my burden to carry. But late at night, when the house settles and old boards creak under their own weight, I sometimes hear that soft older whisper again. Faint, unhurried, following the rhythm of my own breathing. I know it isn't real. I know it's just the echo of memory, the mind replaying the things it doesn't understand. A shadow on a basement floor is just a trick of light. A whisper in an empty room is just houses settling and nerves stretched thin. But even now, all these years later, I still refuse to turn my back on open doorways. And sometimes, on the very quiet nights, I swear the air behind me feels warm, as though someone is standing close enough to speak. I was 19 the first time I took that job on Route 17, and at the time I thought I'd lucked out. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid better than working the gas station counter or stacking lumber at the mill. All I had to do was drive sealed medical kits from the clinic up to a handful of rural homes, then bring whatever paperwork was left on their porches back to town. No talking, no dealing with customers, no late-night drunks. Just a long stretch of mountain road, a thermos of bitter coffee, and whatever music my old truck's radio felt generous enough to play. Route 17 was one of those roads that didn't seem to exist until you were already on it. It didn't appear in GPS directions, and most people in town said it had been rerouted so many times that no one remembered the original path. All I knew was that it ran in a wide curve along the ridge, through pockets of forest where houses hid behind trees so tall you barely noticed the porches tucked in their shadows. At night, the road went dark in a way that felt unnatural, as if the moon refused to shine on it. But I didn't mind the darkness. I'd grown up in the mountains, and the woods had been my backyard. Darkness meant quiet, and quiet meant the shift would pass faster. My first few weeks were easy. I'd finish the route by 1 or 2 in the morning, drive back into town with the heater blowing lukewarm air on my boots, and collapse in bed without thinking about anything except how early I'd have to get up the next day. Nothing strange. Nothing supernatural. Just miles of trees that whispered against each other when the wind pushed through. The night everything changed. I remember it being colder than usual. Cold in a way that seemed to creep up from the road itself, not the air. My breath fogged the glass even with the heater on full, and I rubbed my thumb over the steering wheel to keep the feeling in my hands. The truck rattled with every bump, and the headlights struggled against the dark, like their glow was being swallowed. Around midnight, I came around the bend where the ridge drops off into a long slope of pine and spruce. There's a turnout there, barely larger than a driveway, where sometimes families pull over during the day to take pictures. At night, it always felt like a place where something was waiting. That's when the radio clicked on. It wasn't loud, not at first. Just a soft crackle under the hum of the engine. I thought maybe my elbow had brushed against the knob, but when I looked down, my hand was nowhere near it. The switch had clicked itself. I expected a late-night sermon or maybe some static from a distant station. But instead, a voice drifted through the speakers, quiet, shaky, like someone was reading with their mouth too close to the microphone. It took me a moment to recognize the rhythm of the words. They weren't lyrics or announcements. They were prayers. They didn't sound like any church prayers I'd grown up with. I'd been to enough Sunday services to know most of them by heart. These words were slower, fragmented, almost whispered, like someone was reciting something they'd written themselves. For safety in the dark. For the one who carries the weight. For the child who doesn't know. The voice trembled on the edges of each sentence. I pulled my jacket tighter even though the heater was still blowing. I figured it was just some obscure late-night religious broadcast echoing from across the county. Mountain stations overlapped all the time, especially in winter when the signal bounced weirdly between ridges. I kept driving. But then the voice said my name. Not a shortened version. Not a nickname. My full name, the one only government forms used. It slid through the speakers like someone was sitting in the passenger seat, watching me tense up, waiting for me to react. For him, the voice whispered. Stop what you're carrying. The words hit so suddenly I yanked the wheel a little too hard and felt the back tires skid across loose gravel. The truck lurched toward the shoulder, and I stamped the brake before I could think. Dust kicked up around me, and the headlights cut across the guardrail. My heart hammered in my throat. I stared at the radio, expecting smoke, sparks, something to show it had shorted out. But the faceplate glowed steady, the station number unmoving. I reached forward and flicked the power switch off. The voice didn't stop. If he does not stop, it said, a shiver running under each word. He will not make it home tonight. I grabbed the power cord behind the radio and yanked it free. The display went black. The truck went silent. But the voice kept praying. I felt every muscle in my back go rigid. The prayers grew louder, heavy, and urgent, like the person was panicking. He's in the back, the voice said. You cannot carry him any farther. For a split second, the world narrowed to the cold breath fogging my windshield and the pulse pounding in my ears. My mouth went dry. I twisted the rearview mirror toward the cargo space behind me. The back of the truck was dark, but I could make out the faint outlines of stacked medical boxes, strapped down just like always. There was no one there, but the voice insisted. He's waiting. I shoved the door open and stepped into the freezing air. The silence outside was worse than the voice. Too deep, too complete, like every sound had been swallowed. My flashlight beam jerked as my hand shook. I circled around to the rear, my boots crunching on gravel. I opened the cargo door. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. Just the same sealed kits I'd picked up an hour earlier. Plastic containers, locked with zip ties. No room for anything larger than a bottle of saline. I stared at them, forcing myself to breathe slowly, forcing myself not to let paranoia turn shadows into figures. I slammed the door shut. When I got back into the truck, the voice had grown softer but was still praying, still saying my name, still urging me to stop carrying something I didn't understand. I reached under the dashboard and pulled the fuse connected to the radio system. The display stayed dark. The speakers stayed dark. The voice did not. It whispered now like it had moved backward into the wiring, hiding in some channel deeper than mechanics. Look, it breathed. The windshield had fogged again, more than before. Thick, cloudy, like someone had exhaled heavily across the inside. As I watched, a handprint spread slowly across the fog. 5 fingers, clear, pressed from the inside outward. My breath stalled in my chest. For a moment, I wondered if I had done it earlier, maybe without noticing. But the shape was wrong. Too large. Too spread apart. And I hadn't touched the inside of the glass since the start of the shift. I wiped it away with the back of my sleeve, but the cold knot in my stomach stayed. I didn't wait for explanations. I started the engine, floored the gas, and didn't look in the mirror again until I hit the town line. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the radio was silent. The truck was silent. My hands weren't. The next morning, I brought the paperwork to the clinic, expecting the usual routine: signatures, questions, another set of boxes to pick up. Instead, the administrator blinked at me like I'd shown up with a deer under my arm. "What paperwork?" she asked. "The deliveries from last night," I said. "Home kits for the Ridge houses." She frowned and shook her head. "We haven't sent supplies up the ridge in 2 months. Winter roads are too unstable. We stopped all overnight orders." My throat tightened. "I picked up boxes last night. From the back room." She stared at me. "We didn't prepare any boxes. The back room was locked at 5. I must have looked shaken because her expression softened. She asked if I had slept enough lately, if maybe I'd mixed up the schedules. I wanted to tell her it wasn't the schedule that bothered me. It was the handprint still etched in my mind, the weight of the prayers echoing despite the dead radio. I quit on the spot. She didn't argue. 4 days afterward, I replayed everything. There were explanations, of course, logical ones. Sleep deprivation. Stress. A prank from someone who knew my schedule. A faulty electrical line sending feedback through the speakers. Maybe I had imagined the handprint in the panic of the moment. Memory under fear does strange things. Maybe the boxes had been leftover stock someone forgot to log. Rational answers existed. None were satisfying, but they existed. A week later, I drove Route 17 during the day to prove to myself the road was just a road. Not cursed. Not haunted. Just asphalt and faded paint. Halfway around the bend in the daylight, I saw the turnout again. Empty. Harmless. But something caught my eye. Movement near the ditch. At first, I thought it was a tree stump or old tarp tangled in weeds. But as I slowed down, the shape sharpened. A person sat hunched in the ditch, knees drawn up, face pale as washed linen. They didn't turn toward me. Didn't move. Just sat perfectly still. I blinked and they were gone. Or maybe they'd been a trick of the light, or maybe my brain was still running loops of fear I hadn't processed. I didn't stop to check. I just kept driving. Even now, years later, I don't take Route 17 after dark. Not because I believe something supernatural waits for me, but because I can't shake the memory of a voice speaking my name in the dead quiet of the mountains. I've tried telling myself it was a malfunction, a coincidence, an echo from some obscure broadcast. But sometimes, on long drives, when the signal slips between stations, I hear a familiar tremble beneath the static. A quiet quiver of breath. The start of a prayer that never quite forms words. And every time, I turn the radio off before it finishes. I still remember how the hall smelled the night I first sat with the woman in room 308. Hospitals always had a strange mix of bleach, metal, and something faintly warm underneath, but the night shift made everything sharper, like the smells settled deeper into the walls once the sun went down. My aunt had warned me that nights could get strange, not in a supernatural way, but in the way that exhaustion and silence made your mind reach for things you weren't fully seeing. I thought she meant the usual. Patients yelling out in their sleep or the occasional alarm going off when a monitor slipped. But room 308 was different from the moment I stepped toward it. The door was cracked open, and the hallway lights didn't quite reach inside. The room itself was dim, like someone had turned the brightness down just a bit lower than every other room on the floor. I told myself it was because the staff wanted to let her rest. The charge nurse handed me a clipboard and told me to sit with the woman until things calmed down. They were short-staffed, a couple emergencies had come in, and they needed an extra pair of eyes on her. No one said why she needed to be watched, but I could feel the question hanging between the nurses' glances. There was something unspoken I hadn't been briefed about. She didn't look unusual at first. Pale, maybe a bit too still, but I'd seen sedated patients who looked similar. Her name tag said Esther L., and her age was listed as 58. She had collapsed at home. No injuries. No coma diagnosis. Just unresponsive. Her chest moved evenly, almost too evenly, a mechanical rhythm that made it feel like she wasn't truly breathing on her own. Her eyelids were closed, and there was a twitch beneath them like she was trapped deep inside a dream she couldn't shake. The first hour was nothing remarkable. I sat in the chair by the bed, checking the monitor, adjusting her blanket, writing notes that didn't really matter. The clock on the wall ticked loud in that way clocks only do at 3 in the morning, where every second seems louder than the last. The hospital had gone quiet except for the hum of the ventilation system, a steady rush of air that sometimes changed tone when the building shifted. I caught myself listening too closely to it, as if expecting a voice to come through the ducts. The corners of the room felt darker than they should have been. Not pitch black, just softened, like a shadow was always trying to push out from them. I kept glancing at them without meaning to. Once or twice I thought something had moved there. Just a small shift, the way a coat on a hook can look alive when you're tired. But when I blinked, everything settled back into place. I told myself I was just adjusting to the low light. It wasn't until around the 90-minute mark that things began to take on a tone I couldn't explain away so easily. I heard a soft clicking from the monitor, like it was having trouble picking up her pulse. That wasn't unusual, but when I stood and leaned over to check the leads on her chest, the sound deepened. Instead of a click, it became a slow, dragging thump. I stared at the screen. The pulse line was registering two distinct beats, one normal, steady, and another slower, like something lagging behind. It reminded me of an echo that didn't know when to stop. I tapped the machine lightly. Nothing changed. I checked the wires. Still the same. 2 pulses. One hers. One something else. I could already hear my aunt's voice in my head, telling me that monitors glitch all the time, that sometimes electrical interference made things show up that weren't real readings. The rational part of me held on to that explanation, but it didn't explain why the second beat had a weight to it, a heaviness that made the air feel thicker around the bed. I leaned closer to her, and that's when I saw her lips move. It was subtle, the kind of movement most people would miss. But I was only a foot away. It wasn't a twitch. It wasn't a reflex. It was deliberate, a slow forming of shapes that didn't quite become sound. Her tongue shifted slightly, touching the edge of her teeth, like she was whispering something too faint for the air to carry. I stepped back so fast the chair behind me scraped. The sound snapped me out of whatever haze I'd fallen into, and I told myself I needed someone else to verify what I was seeing. I called my aunt. She answered on the second ring, her voice tired but alert, and when I explained what was happening, there was a pause that lasted a breath too long. She told me to stay in the hall and she'd be there in a minute. When she arrived, she didn't look surprised. Concerned, yes, but not surprised. She stepped just inside the room and watched the monitor herself. Her jaw clenched slightly when she saw the duplicate heartbeat. Then she asked me to show her what I meant about the lips. I didn't want to go near the bed again, but I wasn't going to tell her that. I moved closer, and for a second nothing happened. Then, almost on cue, the woman's lower lip trembled in that same slow-changing movement. My aunt told me to step back, her voice low and calm in a way that told me she was not calm at all. She slipped into the hall and returned with the hospital chaplain. I didn't know him well, but I had passed him a dozen times on my shifts. He always nodded politely, a quiet presence in his tan sweater and old leather shoes. Tonight, though, he stopped in the doorway and didn't step inside. His eyes went straight to the woman, then to the corners of the room, then to the heart monitor. He whispered something under his breath. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet muttering. A habit, maybe. Or maybe not. I couldn't hear it clearly enough to tell. My aunt asked him if he had spoken with the family when she'd been admitted. He nodded slowly, rubbing his thumb over the edge of a bracelet he wore, a simple beaded thing that looked handmade. He said the family hadn't wanted to bring her to the hospital at first. They thought her collapse was spiritual. They'd tried things at home. Traditions. Rituals. Things they felt would help her wake. His tone was neutral, but the way he wouldn't meet our eyes made it clear he didn't fully buy their explanations. Still standing in the doorway, he glanced once more into the dim corners of the room. Then he quietly excused himself, saying if the family returned, we should call him. He left as quickly as he'd come. My aunt didn't call after him. She just watched the empty doorway for a long second before letting out a breath. For the next 3 days, the woman remained exactly the same. Unmoving. Eyes closed. Fingers twitching like she was reaching for something only she could see. The second. Heartbeat faded the next morning, but the memory of it lingered in me like a bruise you forget about until someone touches it. I tried not to think too hard about the way her lips had moved, or the way the chaplain had refused to enter the room, or the way the lights always seemed a bit dimmer in 308, even when I switched on the overheads. I asked another orderly to check the wiring. He said the fixtures were fine. Probably just one of the bulbs was older than the others. But when he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows had settled in deeper, as if listening for something. Maybe it was all in my head. Long shifts do things to you. You start seeing movement where there isn't any. You start hearing breaths that belong to the ventilation system, not the person beside you. But on the second night, when I passed by her room on my break, I paused. The door was closed. It had never been closed before. There was a faint sound coming from inside, like someone murmuring softly. I didn't open the door. I didn't need to. I recognized the cadence. It was the same shape her lips had made when I sat with her. I walked away quickly, telling myself it was probably a nurse talking to her. She died on the third day, sometime around dawn. Her vitals had been declining overnight, and by the time the doctor arrived, there was nothing to be done. They moved her body to the morgue, and the room was cleaned before noon. But the strangest moment came later that evening, when I passed by 308 on my way to clock out. The room was empty. Bed stripped. Machines unplugged. But the heart monitor was still on, and it was showing a heartbeat. Only one. Slow. Heavy. Steady. The kind of beat that seemed to echo in your own chest whether you wanted it to or not. I stood there, watching the green line rise and fall in an otherwise silent room, and for a reason I still don't fully understand, I stepped closer. There was no one in that bed. I could see the mattress clearly. No blankets. No patient. Just the machine, stubbornly pulsing as if someone unseen insisted on being recorded. I reached out and tapped the monitor. The number didn't flicker. Neither did the rhythm. It was as if the machine didn't care whether there was someone alive in front of it. It was determined to pick up something. I backed out slowly, not turning until I reached the hallway, and the moment I broke the threshold, the monitor flatlined. The sound was so sudden I jumped. A long, steady beep. I waited a moment, then the screen went dark. Just like that. I told myself it was a delayed malfunction. A power issue. Something routine. I didn't ask anyone else about it, because I didn't want to hear a confirmation. Or worse, see confusion on their faces. I didn't return to the night shift after that. I picked up mornings and afternoons. My aunt never pushed me on why. She must have suspected something, but she never asked. The hospital moved another patient into 308 a week later. A man recovering from a car accident. I avoided that end of the hall unless I had no choice. Sometimes when I passed by, I felt a faint heaviness in the air, like the room hadn't fully let go of whatever had lingered there. The family of the woman returned once to gather her belongings, a quiet group dressed in plain clothes. One of them, a middle-aged man with a tired face, paused by the door to 308 and stared at it with an expression I couldn't read. Maybe sorrow. Maybe relief. He touched the doorframe gently, then walked away without saying a word. Months later, long after she'd been forgotten by most of the staff, I had a dream about her. Not a frightening one, just unsettling. In the dream, she was lying in the bed in 308, eyes closed, fingers twitching like she had been before. But this time I could hear her voice clearly, whispering those same soft, unintelligible syllables. When I woke up, the room was cold, like someone had opened the window, even though it was sealed shut. I don't know what really happened in room 308. Maybe it was all fatigue and shadows and failing equipment. Maybe I let my imagination run too far on those long, silent nights. But even now, when I think back on it, I can still picture the exact moment her lips moved, forming words that never made it to sound. And I can still hear that slow, dragging heartbeat, steady and patient, like something waiting to be recognized. I haven't worked a night shift since, and whenever I walk past an empty hospital room, I keep my eyes on the ground. Because sometimes, if I look too long into the dim corners, I swear I'll see something move just out of sight. Jared and I had been doing home repairs for a few summers, mostly small jobs around family properties and a couple of rentals here and there. When a call came from a man who owned a cabin deep in the Blue Ridge, we thought it would be a simple day trip, replace some rotted boards, tighten a loose window, check for leaks. He explained over the phone that the house made breathing noises at dawn, and we laughed at it. Most of the time, these old cabins just creaked and groaned as the morning sun hit the timbers. Maybe bad insulation. Maybe raccoons or squirrels in the walls. He insisted it wasn't ordinary, that the sound was unmistakable and only happened at sunrise. We agreed to take a look. The drive up was quiet, the road narrowing as we left the main highway behind. Trees pressed in on both sides, and the mist was just beginning to lift from the valleys when we turned down a dirt track that seemed to wind endlessly before the cabin came into view. It was one of those structures that looked older than any document could account for. Hand-hewn beams, a sagging roof, the kind of place that had existed for generations. The owner met us outside, a gaunt man with a tight expression, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. He didn't shake our hands, just gestured for us to follow him inside. From the moment we stepped in, the air felt different. Warm, almost humid in a way that seemed to press against my skin, like stepping into a sauna left running overnight. I told myself it was the temperature of the valley at dawn, damp air from the rising sun, but Jared and I both noticed it. The kind of heaviness that makes the back of your throat feel dry. We started checking the floors, the doors, the windows, trying to find anything obvious that could cause the noises. At first, it was subtle. A slight creak here, a groan there, nothing unusual for a cabin this old. But as 5 a.m. approached, just when the sunlight began brushing the tops of the nearby trees, the sensation changed. It wasn't a sound at first, not one you could place, it was a shift. The walls themselves seemed to expand and contract, almost imperceptibly. You could feel it under your boots, a slow movement, like the entire structure had taken a breath. Jared froze mid-step. I could see his eyes widen, staring down the hallway. I felt it too, a subtle pressure, a shift in the air as if the room itself were exhaling after holding its breath for a long time. There was no wind, no draft from the open windows. Just the sensation of something moving, slow and steady, in every direction at once. Then I heard it. A sound, soft and fleeting, almost like an exhale from deep within the house itself. It wasn't words. Not exactly. Just a long, gentle sigh that ended in a whisper of warmth against my face, like someone relieved we had finally arrived. I turned quickly, expecting the owner to be there, but he was pale, standing rigid in the corner. He didn't speak. He just looked at us, expression tight, as if he had been waiting years for someone to notice. We tried the front door next, assuming maybe a window or a latch had swelled overnight. It wouldn't budge. Not stuck in the usual way, not warped from age, it was held solid. I pressed with both hands, Jared shoulder to shoulder with me, and we couldn't force it open. The sensation in the air intensified, a low vibration under our feet, a subtle but insistent weight that pressed down through the floorboards. The owner spoke for the first time. His voice was low, strained, almost trembling. He told us this had started after a failed exorcism in the basement. He didn't elaborate at first, just that something had been removed. But the man who led the ritual had died that same night. Whatever it had been, it had no place to go and simply remained. It settled. Rooted. The cabin itself seemed to hold it in place, and it responded whenever strangers were inside. He begged us not to tell anyone. We exchanged glances, skeptical but uneasy. We moved through the cabin, checking the basement. The air there was cooler but damp, the smell of mildew and old wood heavy in our noses. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, though the beams creaked under our steps as if the house was aware of our presence. We tried to measure the floorboards, check for leaks, listen for loose joists. Everything was exactly as it should be for a structure this age. Yet the weight of the air remained, and in certain corners, the space felt almost alive. Back upstairs, the sunrise had broken fully over the trees. Light streamed through the windows, but it didn't change the feel of the house. The walls no longer seemed to breathe, and the pressure under our feet returned to normal. The front door opened on its own with a soft click. The owner's relief was palpable, almost desperate. He urged us to leave quickly, thanked us and closed the door behind us. I remember feeling the chill of the morning air, the smell of the forest after the sun warmed the mist, and thinking how normal everything looked now, but how different it had felt inside. The drive down the winding dirt track was silent. Jared didn't speak. I didn't speak. Both of us were aware of how ordinary the world seemed outside that cabin. The birds, the rustle of wind through the trees, the quiet town awakening. But we couldn't shake the impression of that slow, steady exhale, the sense that the walls themselves had been waiting and breathing while we were there. In the days that followed, I kept thinking about the air in that cabin. Warm, humid, pressing. Nothing in the construction or the climate should have caused it. The wood wasn't damp enough. There were no hidden vents. No animals. I ran through every plausible explanation I could think of: temperature inversion, barometric pressure, old structural timbers, but none fully accounted for the sensation of the house breathing, or the almost imperceptible sigh that had greeted us in the hallway. I returned to work at other properties, fixing roofs and floors and windows, but that cabin stayed in my mind. Occasionally, when the wind was just right in my own home, I would catch a faint creak or a soft exhale in the corners of my rooms, and I'd pause, certain for a second that the house itself was aware of my presence, moving subtly with me, waiting. Of course, it was just an old building settling, I told myself, nothing more. But the memory of that morning, the way the walls had expanded without moving, the subtle pressure under our boots, stayed with me in a way that no ordinary noise or creak ever had. Months later, I told a friend about it while we were fixing a neighbor's porch. He laughed, said I was just imagining things, that old cabins do odd stuff in the mornings. I wanted to agree with him. I wanted to convince myself that it had been nothing, a trick of the light and air. But when I closed my eyes, I could still feel the shift under my feet, the air warm and heavy around my chest, the soft exhale from the hallway, a voice without words, waiting. I never went back. I haven't even driven past the dirt track that leads up to that cabin. But on some mornings, before the sun fully rises, when the house around me creaks in the early chill, I swear I can hear that same long, gentle exhale in my own home. It isn't loud. It isn't demanding. Just a soft breath that seems to come from the walls themselves, subtle enough that I question whether it's real. I've checked every vent, every gap in the foundation, every loose board. There's nothing. Just an ordinary house, standing quiet, solid, ordinary. And yet, in the stillest moments, I remember the pressure of that cabin, the weight of its breath, and the certainty that it had been aware we were there, waiting. And somehow, in those mornings before dawn, I feel it again. The subtle expansion of walls that don't move, the soft exhale that isn't a person's, and the quiet insistence that the house remembers. I never spoke of it beyond that day. Jared hasn't either. Some things, we decided, are better left unexamined. And every time I hear a strange settling in a building, or a whisper of warm air against my face in the quiet, I can't help but think back to that cabin in Blue Ridge, where the house breathed, and we were not quite sure what it meant, but we knew we had felt it. I started babysitting Micah when I was 16. His mother had asked me to help out while she worked night shifts at the hospital. I didn't mind. He was quiet, polite, and never caused trouble. He had the kind of demeanor that made you forget a child was even there, moving through the house with the soft-footed care of someone older than their years. For months, it was easy. We'd read books, watch quiet shows, and I'd make snacks while he sat at the kitchen table coloring. Winter evenings were long, the house warm from the old radiator, and Micah's calm presence made the time pass faster than I expected. Then one January, when he was around 7, things changed. He had been sick for weeks, the kind of lingering illness that left him pale and tired, coughing more than he should, sleeping more than was normal. His mother mentioned a traveling preacher who had come to town, someone claiming he could pull sickness out by prayer. They'd let him visit, and after that, Micah began acting differently. At first, it was small things. A glance that lingered too long in corners, a hesitation before answering questions. But it wasn't until he started speaking again that I noticed the change. One night, maybe a week after the preacher had been, I woke to hear him standing in the hallway outside my room. I remember thinking he must have been sleepwalking, but the way he stood, still, hands by his side, staring at the far corner as if waiting for something, I felt my chest tighten. I called his name softly, and he turned to me. The words that came out weren't his. Not a deeper voice, not a strange tone. Just wrong. Flat, measured, older, tired. It carried a weight that made the hairs on my neck rise. I asked him what he was doing, expecting maybe a sleep-talking answer or some mumbled nonsense. But he spoke clearly. He said things that no child should know, things that only I had ever seen or experienced. My father's grave, the accident my sister had when she was 5, secrets I had buried so deep in the folds of my own mind I didn't even think about them anymore. I froze, unsure if I should scream, run, or just sit silently. It was unsettling in a way I couldn't explain. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he'd overheard conversations I had long forgotten. Maybe my exhaustion had made me hallucinate. But the precision with which he spoke the details made me doubt myself. When I told his mother, she brushed it off as fever dreams. She said he'd been sick, that the illness made him delirious, that I was imagining things. She insisted it was nothing. I wanted to argue, to insist that something wasn't right, but I didn't. I kept my thoughts to myself, trying to keep calm so I wouldn't scare him. Micah didn't appear frightened, just quiet, watching me in that same unreadable way as if he was aware I was noticing something unusual. The next few nights followed a similar pattern. He would stand in the hallway, whispering things I couldn't always hear, sometimes waiting, sometimes talking to corners, and I would sit on the floor of his room, pretending to read while listening to him. Occasionally, he would repeat words I had never said aloud, fragments of memories I hadn't shared with anyone. My mind tried to reason through every possibility. Could it be coincidence? Could it be the things I had spoken in passing, overheard by him at some point, rearranged in a way that made them seem deliberate? I wanted to believe that. I wanted it to be something explainable. The last night I ever babysat him was the worst. It was late January, bitter and still outside. I had stayed up reading by the glow of a small lamp, listening to the wind scrape along the eaves. Micah woke me again, standing in the hallway as before. I sat up slowly, unsure if I wanted to approach. He didn't turn his head when I called, didn't react the way he normally did. The voice came, low, steady, and precise. He whispered something I can still hear to this day. He didn't leave. He just needed a smaller place to hide. I froze completely. I didn't know what to do. I tried to speak, to ask him what he meant, but my voice caught in my throat. There was no one else in the house. No trickery, no sound from outside. Just him, the hallway, and that voice that wasn't entirely his. I thought I was imagining it, maybe losing my mind from the combination of the long winter nights and too many stories I had read about strange things in the mountains. But the certainty in those words made my stomach tighten. It wasn't a fever dream, at least I didn't think it was. By morning, Micah's voice was back to normal. He spoke softly, hesitant, but there was nothing unusual in the sound. He refused to speak much for nearly a week, almost as if he had been holding something back, or perhaps recovering from what had come through him. When he finally did speak, he asked me why I had been crying in the hallway that night. I was shocked. I had not left my room, had not cried. I had done my best to stay still, to appear calm, but somehow he had perceived my fear, my uncertainty, my disbelief. I left that job soon after. I told his mother I had too many school responsibilities, that the winter had been harder than I realized. I never babysat for him again, and I avoided talking about that night with anyone, partly because I didn't want them to think I was losing it, and partly because I didn't want to confront what I might have actually seen or felt. Even now, years later, the memory remains vivid. When I walk down a quiet hallway, when I hear a child's voice echo in an empty room, I flinch. I remember Micah, and the voice that wasn't entirely his. I remember the precision with which he spoke, the weight in his tone, and the way it made the ordinary world seem fragile, uncertain, and easily bent. I try to rationalize it. Illness. Fever. Imagination. I tell myself children are perceptive, that perhaps he had learned things from me, from my family, from long-forgotten conversations, and somehow pieced them together. But that explanation doesn't cover the certainty, the way the voice seemed aware of me, of what I had buried, of what I thought no one could ever know. Sometimes I replay the nights in my head, remembering how he would stand so still, waiting for something. The way the winter wind sounded outside, the faint creak of the old floorboards, the way the hallway seemed longer in the quiet darkness. I remember the fear that rooted me to the spot, the chill that ran down my spine without a draft, the sense of something listening to everything I thought was hidden. I haven't babysat since. I don't volunteer with children. I avoid quiet nights alone in houses that creak and groan. I avoid looking too closely at shadows in hallways. And yet, every time I hear a child's voice in the distance, soft, almost echoing, I remember Micah. I remember that borrowed voice and the way it could speak what I had tried to hide. I remember how the ordinary world can suddenly feel uncertain, how easily your mind can be unsettled when faced with someone or something that seems to know too much. Even years later, when I hear a child giggling or calling out somewhere in the house, I stop. I listen. My hands tighten. My chest aches. And for a moment, I wonder if that voice has returned, waiting again in the hallway, quiet, patient, and fully aware of the things I thought I had buried long ago.